Welcome to JCAT, a program that seeks to introduce Japanese contextualized literature and ideas for use by missionaries and anyone that seeks to share the gospel with Japanese people.
日本人から聞く日本のキリスト教。
Okay, welcome back to JCats. So today what I wanted to do was kind of try and keep things rolling from last time, talking about the Japanese contextualized sermon. Again, what I was reading from the last time from this, it's Senkyogaku Readings, 日本文化とキリスト教 RAC Network.com is where you can purchase this book. Over 400 pages of single-spaced contextualization goodness, not translated into English. So what I did is I ran the articles that I wanted to look at through like a translator online. Some of it comes out a little funky, but I think for the most part the basic point comes across. There are 2 articles in this book about preaching. Last time we went over 日本に文脈された説教, the Japan contextualized sermon. And then I wanted to go over the next article, which translates to something like the sermon that touches the heart of Japanese people. And that's like a roundtable discussion on the topic. And so the major points that he went over was, and this really doesn't even have to be preaching. I think this could be applied if you wanted to, just to like apologetics. Like, we tend to share the gospel. If we want to share the whole gospel in one sitting, maybe we start with God, like the color, am I dating myself here with like the wordless book with the colors, and one color would represent like creation, and then one color would represent like sin, like you'd have like a black page would be sin. And so, you can share the gospel in this way. And I think a lot of us do, we say, okay, God, perfect God, created a perfect world, made or created a good world, made good humans. Humans chose to rebel against God by sinning. And then the world fell. And then Jesus came and saved the world, and the people in the world specifically, maybe, is kind of how. So trust in Jesus, be saved. That's okay. Like, obviously a super condensing, but that's kind of like a typical gospel presentation in my background. And then I think what Fukuda Sensei was really trying to get at in his article, the Japan Contextualized Sermon, was, rather than saying like God, sin, grace, he starts with common grace, and then something like God can heal your isolation, which would be, theologically we would see that as a result of sin. And then and he also mentions the idea of sin as sort of being ungrateful for the common grace that God offers, which I suppose, biblically, you certainly could draw the lines for that. I'm going to highlight just a few quotes here from that before I move on, because we did talk about this last week. Yeah. So under that okage image, again, okage being okage-sama de, which is a response when someone says, "How you doing? O genki desu ka? O genki desho ka?" Okage-sama de genki desu. Something. Okage-sama de means thanks to grace, and it's ambiguous, which Japanese people love. Apparently. I also like being ambiguous. In fact, a lot of the times when I communicate with people, I'll just say like half a sentence and then like kind of drop it off, like the second half is sort of implied, and they always know what's going on. They always just like, "Oh yeah." And Eve, I'll just take it a step further. This is hilarious to me, because it feels like it could be inappropriate, but anyway. I'll just tell you. So I was at a funeral for a church guy who was our pastor's father-in-law, and he was in his 90s. And for the funeral, his son, this is a Japanese man, his son had to fly into Japan from the States, where the son pastors, I believe, a Japanese American church, or just a Japanese church in America, like a Japanese language church in America, but speaks fluent English and everything, right? And so I was like, yeah, what do you say at funerals? I mean, I'm saying this to the son of the deceased. Like, so this is actually the person I should be saying something to, rather than asking him what you would say to someone in this case. And he's kind of good natured and everything. And he says, "Oh yeah, whenever I go to a funeral, I just say, kono tabi ni," and then I don't finish my sentence. I just kind of mumble some words, and other people are like, "Oh yeah, thanks." Kono tabi ni is like, on this like journey of yours, ... and then he said it just works like that. And I've actually tried it at other funerals. And I'm like, "Oh, kono tabi ni," kind of, and people are like, thanks, thanks, buddy. And I'm not going to do that anymore, because I just don't have the confidence to do that. I'm getting old. I don't know. But like, I'm going to probably say a complete sentence at a funeral when I'm trying to comfort the grieving. But that's, that level of aimai, ambiguity, works so well in Japan. And I'm off track. But let's see. Ambiguity. Oh yeah, okage-sama de. The ambiguity of thanks to grace. Whose grace? What grace? Not really important, perhaps. Not really important to nail that down. Just, I have a thankful attitude towards the grace that is sort of being shown to me by a higher power. Okage-sama de genki desu. Right? Okay. And then here's a part that I highlighted. I don't think I read it last week. For Japanese people, it should be easy to imagine a God who makes the sun rise over the good and rain over the bad, a God who nourishes the birds of the air and dresses the wild flowers and grasses. And then I think I may have mentioned this last week. He says the Okage image is often associated with expressions related to water in Japan, where there's much rainfall. So in preaching, depicting images of pouring grace, filling grace, overflowing grace as a flow of life that purifies and keeps alive, etc., can be an effective introduction to lead the recipients to other aspects of truth. So you're trying to connect with what people know and connect with rhythms that are familiar with them, which again, in the West, if we say God loves you, has a wonderful plan for your life, or just says that God this, God that, we, being from a culture, generally speaking, that sort of recognizes monotheism. When you say God, you're generally talking about creator God. But in Japan, that's not the case without some explanation. And even if you do make the explanation, you've got to make the explanation in such a way that you're talking about the God who created, and people will get it. But I think the point is that it's Fukuda, right? Yeah. Sensei here is saying start with what people know, common grace, things that they already recognize as good. Yeah. And then I'm going to scroll down, and we've got the later for the average Japanese person who is continually subjected to deviation score based evaluations as a student, and who, as a member of society, is absorbed into a corporate community that places the highest value on gambarism. Convincing people of Christ's unconditional acceptance will not be an overnight task, but only this message can free the Japanese from the noose of isolation and lead them into a new relationship with God, giving them a new status as God's people. Okay, so I thought this was interesting because having a Japanese wife and 4 5/8 Japanese children, I'm a quarter Okinawan, so that's why they get 5/8. Not important. One of my kids goes to international school, and this a few weeks ago, my wife told me there was this thing at the. Oh no, I went. I was there. I was paying attention. I think it was talking about colleges. My son's almost in high school, so some of the parents uh, are thinking about college. And one of the parents was like raising their hand and asking questions. A Japanese parent. It's international school. A lot of the students are local Japanese kids that want to do their education in English. And talking about scores, there was this confusion, and the person answering questions said something to the effect of like, no, all the kids can get A's if they do the work. If they get the questions right, then they all get A's. And that was here this article. It reminded me of that. The Fukuda Sensei says for the average Japanese person who is continually subjected to deviation score based evaluations as a student, it blew this mom away that all the students in the class theoretically could get A's if they all did the work, rather than and my wife explained to me this because she's Japanese and she went to Japanese school all through college. She's like, no, in our schools, X percent of students get the good grades, and then X percent of students get the leftover grades. So, no, not everybody theoretically could get good grades, which sort of illustrates in Japan part of why things are so competitive. You don't just have to get a good score at school. You got to beat your friends. You got to beat the other kids in your class. You got to be like, it's almost, well, be getting sidetracked, but it's like in sports, right? You've got to be not just the best player in your school. You got to be, good enough, better than all the other guys that want one of those minor league jobs or something. I'm getting sidetracked, but the point is, high pressure. Gambarism, again here, I mentioned it last week. Gambaru is to like try hard. So corporate community that places the highest value on gambarism. He's just anglifying a Japanese word. Gambarism. The, value of like trying your best and making that sort of your number one thing. Yeah. And I will continue on because this is not the only article that I wanted to get to. Under The subheading surrendering self to eternal being, I highlighted. In the depths of the Japanese collective unconscious, there is a desire to surrender oneself to eternal existence. Therefore, the evangelists in Japan can point to the fact that nature, or the way, in the case of abandoning the ascetic's way of thinking and following nature. Finish that sentence. Is compatible with Christ, the fundamental life that pervades the universe. Okay, so again, in conclusion, it would be effective to speak not in the order of God, sin, and salvation in Western theology, but in the order of okage, grace, and surrender. And on that basis, while avoiding the danger of mixing religions, to appeal to the transcendent personal God who gives okage, sin as ingratitude, and the joy of salvation as a result of self-surrender. Okay. Pushback. I think if there is any pushback toward this, it is that it does not talk much about sin. That's where I wanted to bring in some stuff from the round table discussion that's also in the same book, Senkyogaku Readings. Again, you can get that at rac-network.com if you can fill out forms in Japanese. But again, the guy who takes your orders does speak English. Good guy. Matsuda Sensei, he's in the earlier episodes if you look and you're interested in hearing that discussion. Okay. I'm going to look this up. Okay. Yeah. So in the roundtable discussion that's recorded in the next article in the book, Fukuda Sensei, who's also the author of the previous article, okay, he's one of the roundtable discussers, and he goes over this sin stuff a bit more. In traditional Japanese evangelistic preaching, the absolute God is mentioned first, which is a little difficult for Japanese to understand. Then, sin is discussed next. However, this is also difficult to understand because it deals with the personal relationship to the absolute God. And since it speaks of salvation from sin, it is also difficult to understand. So instead of this one God, one sin, one salvation, I think he's actually referring now to the article that we just went over. I wrote, Fukuda says, how about the following order? The okage, the healing of the wound, the healing grace, and then surrendering oneself to the one who heals. It is difficult to say which comes first, God's grace or the awareness of sin. When you understand the grace of God, you will understand your own image. And when you understand your own image, you will understand the grace of God who accepts you. So I think we can talk later about sin as ingratitude, the failure to respond to the grace that was given in the first place. I do not mean that we should neglect sin or treat it lightly, but I think it is very effective to begin with what I call, and again, now this translator went with lizard because it thought that where he said okage, the thing meant tokage, which means lizard. That's what happens sometimes when you use like an AI translator. Okage is what's meant here. So again, that okage-sama, de grace, thanks to grace image. Okay. Now I'm going to just kind of scan through. A second person in the so another one of the people in the round table picking up on the sin concept. He says sin is also a relational concept. It can only be understood in the context of fellowship. However, when we generally speak of God, sin, salvation, we often speak of sin as an act. Therefore, there is a tendency for people to think of repentance as a way of becoming a good person after having done something wrong. I think there's a Confucian element in the spiritual soil of the Japanese people in general. He says, I do not know much about Confucianism, but I do know that the foundation of Confucianism is action. The fundamental elements of Confucianism are loyalty and filial piety. Loyalty to one's master, filial piety to one's parents. And they're shown by one's deeds. Okay, if you behave, he says, if you behave well, you're a good subject and a good child. On the other hand, there's a strong sense that if you are not a good child, you will not be accepted. So he says, I call this good boy syndrome, and I think it is generally observed among Japanese people. In the Christian faith, as in the case of sin, faith is a matter of relationship, but it is also a matter of action. Scrolling down a bit here. I actually a piece of paper, so I'm not scrolling with my eyes. Let's see. A good child is one who does what his or her parents tell him or her to do, which is the Japanese definition of a good child. This is often projected onto the relationship with God. So again, sort of a kind of a works thing is sort of the temptation, I think, and it seems like that's maybe part of the reason that these gentlemen are trying to steer the discussion away from sin, because in the Japanese maybe mind, the remedy would be to do stuff, be good. I mean, look, we can kind of read through this, and some of the answers are going to be similar to some of the way that we would answer them in the States or in the West. You know, it's a relationship, not a religion. Let's see. So let's see. He says, okay, from the same quote, the end of this particular gentleman, Ono Sensei. What is really a matter of relationship is always replaced by a superficial matter of action. I don't know about other cultures, but I suspect that this is the case, at least among the Japanese. So, as a result, I feel that faith becomes legalistic, and that when one preaches the law, one becomes legalistic. All right, let me go to the next page. Who am I quoting here? Oh, so this is going to be Ono-san again after a little banter with his guys. Let's see. All right. I always emphasize God's grace, but I have a fear that I am lacking balance. God's harshness and severity towards sin must never be obscured. I believe that God's harshness towards sin should never be obscured, and it is an area that human beings should never blur. On the other hand, I believe that sin can only be seen in grace. The awareness of sin is also a blessing from God. The parable of the prodigal son is a typical example. When the son came to himself, it was his father's mercy that made him want to return to his father. Okay, this gels with what Fukuda sensei was saying about sin sort of being seen or described as a like a rejection of grace, or a ingratitude toward the grace that you were given initially. So I think this is really a point that we can take to heart. Sin should be presented as something that happens in relationship. Sin is not about doing bad things. Sin would be, sin is not about failing to do good things. It's about rejecting Creator God. It's about rejecting in the grace that is given to you. Okay. Let's see. So Ono-san, he's gonna start talking about a story, and apparently all the other guys it's kind of an inside joke. They all know the story. Keep in mind these probably 20 some years ago. If anything sounds less politically correct, just don't worry about it too much. I'm not sure that all these guys are even still alive, honestly. Ono-san says, my wife often says to me when she comes home from shopping for dinner, today is your favorite day too. My wife comes home, I bought your favorite thing today. Why would she buy my favorite thing? There's two possibilities, he says. If she doesn't buy me what I like, I will beat her up. He's joking. There's laughter. Then she would get scared, worried that she might miss something, and as a result, she would buy what I like. The other's a little more subtle, but because there's love there, I am compelled, not forced, to buy what I like. In this case, the crucial point is not whether or not I buy what I like, but the fact that a relationship is formed that results in such an act. So I think what he's really trying to get at here is repentance, living the Christian life. Being good is not the good boy syndrome is not the driving force that maybe would be the driving force in trying to be good in a Confucian framework, but being good because goodness is part of who God is. So wanting to be like good to God is correct behavior in relationship. In the same way, maybe that rebellion might be a word that we might use more in the West because it's a little stronger, but ingratitude is the word that Fukuda uses. So ingratitude resulting in spurning grace, right? Is the idea of sin in relationship to God, not doing something bad, but being ungrateful for the goodness and rejecting it. So you see, they're kind of the same thing, but you want to present it in the way that works for the audience. Ono-san is going to finish here. In this sense, I think that Japanese people are in danger of falling into a tendency toward legalism. That is why I always emphasize the importance of creating relationships. In my sermons, I rarely tell people what to do or not to do, he says. Okay, so that's kind of what I've got for that second that roundtable discussion. For me, the takeaway is that we should talk about sin as it is in relation to God, not independent. Sin is not doing bad stuff; it's rejecting God's gifts to us.